Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Running for federal office now comes with security costs that were once rare, and those costs are rising fast. A new analysis looks at how the growing need for personal and digital security is changing who can realistically run for office, and how campaigns operate behind the scenes. We'll talk through what that shift means for access, participation, and the health of democratic institutions with Justin Sherman of the Public Service Alliance. Justin, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
You've got a new report out at Public Service Alliance on the cost to run for office. When you think about the data that you found and what it takes to run for federal office today, what feels most out of alignment with how our democratic system is supposed to function?
It's out of alignment, among other reasons, because it costs so much to ensure you can run safely. And that's really the alarming big point here, right? I mean, at PSA, we're a nonpartisan organization. We focus both on research of this issue space as well as I know you've covered on this program before, providing discounted security and privacy and other tools to public servants across the country who need them. And so in looking at this last decade of federal campaign and committee spending data, what we see is really an unsustainable over 5 times increase just in the last decade in the amount of money that these various groups have to spend on bulletproof vests, on bodyguards, on event security, on home alarm systems. And so to get to the crux of your question, it's really concerning that in order to run for public office for an American who wants to serve their community, they have to not only think about, the dollars to buy the flyers and do the get out the vote events and send around the pins in the neighborhood, but also about what they need to do to make sure they don't get attacked, or what happens if I get a death threat, or how do I protect my home from someone who doxes me. And so we'll dig more into the numbers, but that's really the concerning top line of this study. And I think it is not, it's certainly not a good indication of where we are right now vis-a-vis public servants.
Thank you for the overall message here. And let's dig into the numbers. You looked at the last 5 election cycles. So tell us about the trajectory of the spending and how you've seen changes over that time frame.
Sure. So campaigns and committees and other organizations are required to, under federal law, submit a wide range of expense receipts and other information to the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. And so, as you noted, we went back through at the time of the report's authoring what were the last 5 campaign cycles. So these are 2015-16, 2017-18, 2019-20, 2021-22, and 2023 to 2024. The FEC, we're recording this middle of April, the FEC now has just been starting to release the data from 2025 to 2026. So that's actually something we will be taking a look at and publishing yet more information on that. But I'll just say we looked at this last 10 years of data and really zeroed in on, let's look across these many, gazillions of expenses, filter down to those focused on security. And then within that, can we tabulate across the years what was spent in terms of the temporal changes? And then can we tabulate across categories? So looking at things like home security upgrades, looking at digital security spending, right? Because so many threats, of course, are in the digital sphere. So some top line numbers, we found that at least $104 million in that time period went towards security across these campaigns and committees. I say at least because this is a conservative number, right? Not every expense is explicitly listed as security. Sometimes it could be put under office expenses or building fees, right? And not labeled as security. Or we went through thousands and thousands and thousands manually of expenditures, but you could go through even more if you add in words that are about security, but don't use the word security, right? So all to say, it's at least this number. We think the actual is much higher. So 104 million. I'll give you a couple other stats up front. The increase I mentioned, the spending in the 2023 to 2024 cycle on security, more than 5 times what it was in 2015 to 2016. So we really see a huge spike. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of that spike is reflected in these different sub areas. So event security spending continues to go up overall. Security on Digital issues continues to go up, and then perhaps we'll dig more into this one because I think it's one of the most disturbing is that home-related security spending through campaigns and committees continues to rise as well.
Justin, where does the money come from to pay for those expenses? Is it coming from campaign coffers? Is it coming from congressional offices, from the candidate's own personal checking account?
This is a really great question. In this case, we focus specifically on expenditures that campaigns and committees make and report to the FEC. So this does not include, which is really important, and I'm glad you underscored this, it does not include something that a sitting member of Congress gets as a result of having U.S. Capitol Police resources, right? Not every member, as we know, and as you've certainly talked about on other episodes, not every member obviously gets a personal detail, but they do have access to threat monitoring, to building security, things of that sort, right? This does not include, which is way higher of an expense, Secret Service protection provided to presidential and vice presidential candidates at that point in the campaign when that gets activated, which is something that the taxpayer, rightfully so, but that the taxpayer, that the federal government pays for, not the campaign. So again, there are categories that aren't covered here. You could also have candidates and individuals that spend money on home security in ways that are not reported here. I'm not a campaign finance law expert, but certainly those we consulted for this study and others have written about this, right? It kind of varies. The guidance has changed a bit, which is good that campaigns and candidates can spend more money on security. This is not something captured here, but also members of Congress can allocate more of their office funds towards security. In the last couple of years, a lot don't use it, which is sort of an interesting side point. But all to say, so it doesn't include those several categories. It's really focused on, as mentioned, if you're fundraising for a campaign, for a committee, you're factoring in your head, or perhaps you aren't and you end up spending a lot on it later, that you need to be spending this money on physical and digital security.
I'm speaking with Justin Sherman. He's Vice President of the Security Project at the Public Service Alliance. Justin, what does this tell us then about the people who can afford to run for office?
It's highly troubling because it creates yet another barrier to entry to public service, right? Other groups, we cite, for example, a study done by the Vote Mama Foundation, which does excellent work on this topic, among many others, that looked at this specifically with a lens towards parents and caregivers and women. Obviously, we know when it comes to violence and doxing and violent threats in general, that women are at disproportionate risk, women of color are at disproportionate risk, people of color are at disproportionate risk, et cetera. And so all to say, it's already varied who can run for office, how much it takes to do so. There's the class dynamic that cuts across demographics of, if you're wealthier, of course, you can fund your own campaign and so on. And so the fact that for a candidate, it might cost an extra, whether it's 10 grand or 100 grand or 500 grand for the high spenders to cover your security to run, that's really concerning, right? That's going to be prohibitive for some people. And even if it's not prohibitive, it means rather than spending those campaign or committee dollars on things like get out the vote events or bipartisan meetings with future constituents or, policy or polling work, it's instead going towards mitigating risks of violence.
Beyond those really important limitations, what does this increased focus on personal security mean for how events are conducted, how campaigns are conducted?
I'd say two things. So one is it reflects what we've seen many policymakers, public servants, elected officials say in polling and surveys. I'm thinking of Princeton University's Bridging Divides initiative and work with other partners who have looked at this, not just at the federal level, but other levels, right? Where lots of people trying to run for office or commit a life to public service are worried about voicing certain policy views that are contentious, or maybe they pull back more from public events. They do fewer events. The events are less open. You have to RSVP ahead of time. You need to go through 5 metal detectors to get in there, right? I mean, it just creates a different atmosphere than having, we think of the traditional sort of, stump on a log, stand up and talk on the street corner, right? If we think back to, older days of politics, that's not really something a lot of folks feel comfortable doing these days. So it kind of creates this and contributes to, I think, this pullback effect in how our public servants are willing to engage. which, we haven't studied this in detail, but I'm sure also then contributes in some insidious ways to the threat landscape, right? Folks feel like it's harder to access politicians or they're more removed from public life. The second thing I want to highlight, I mentioned earlier, which is a huge spike in home-related security spending. We detected, again, I doubt in practice there was nothing spent on this, but at least in our data, we found zero expenditures in 2015 to 2016 that were marked as home security. That total grows quickly towards $1 million as you get closer to the present. And so in some cases that was CCTV cameras. In other cases, that's physical upgrades. So hardening windows, one can imagine that probably means bulletproof glass. I mean, things that are horrifying, right? Not only just as Americans who want to see people serve in public without fear, but also knowing that people's children are there, right? And we've seen lots of acts of violence where kids are home, parents are home, grandparents are home. And so I'll just say that's really the second thing. And I think that if we're looking at ways really capable, honest, hardworking Americans are going to be deterred from public service and running for office, it's going to be threatening your kids and your family. And so that's really another, again, lots of others have written on this problem as well. And that was something concerning we found in this campaign spending data.
Justin, there's one more complexity that I want to ask you about as you think about event security, home security, as you just mentioned. This security infrastructure oftentimes draws on services that intersect with federal regulation, with law enforcement, with public-private coordination. So what kind of demand is this putting on, say, the local police departments or other kinds of private security services?
It's definitely demands there, as you're noting, right? I mean, anecdotally, there are a number of cases in the spending data where folks hired really prominent, large national companies. I mean, companies many people would immediately recognize on TV or by name to do some aspect of their security. There were other times where, kind of to your question, I looked up a few anecdotally, a local company or in many cases actually hiring, off-duty police officers, of course, for security, which many businesses and others also do, right? In nightclubs and others in day-to-day life. But that was a real source of spending too. And so I think it contributes to, in some ways, those are opportunities for those businesses. And there's this market that, of course, raises questions, like we said, about what are the costs? Are these services, which is something at PSA we talk about a lot, are these services vetted, right? Because there are lots of great companies and services out there providing important security offerings. There are others out there that are way overpriced or don't actually deliver what the delta between what they say they do and what they actually do is huge. And so that's concerning. And the last thing is what we don't know, it's not captured in this data. It's something we're interested in studying more, is what you said. What's the cost to the taxpayer because of the local, which is maybe what you were getting at, the local response, right? When you have doxing and swatting, as I've written about before, that is police now not responding to something else, right? I mean, we all know that no government organization on earth has unlimited resources. So, the idea that huge increases in these threats or online doxing and so on, a lot of which don't materialize, and this is part of the problem, don't materialize into real violence. And so on the one hand, you have local law enforcement chasing all these leads and chasing all these ends, again, pulling time from other public safety priorities. At the same time, some of them do flip into real world violence, right? We saw the horrific murder of Melissa Hortman and her husband and the shooting of 2 others last year. And the individual who allegedly did that had a list where he wrote down the names of the data brokers, the people search websites he had used to look up and research his targets. So, it's really complicated. All to say, it's not numbers we captured in this report per se, but I think, as you note, the strain we're seeing on the federal campaign and committee system for security is reflective of other strains on local public servants, local law enforcement, others who are trying to, keep their communities safe.
This is really sobering data, and it has big implications about the future of elections and who can run and, as we say, who can represent their constituencies. We're talking here only at the federal level, but our understanding is the same sorts of patterns are playing out in state and local elections. As you look forward, what do you see on the horizon? Is there hope for change here? What would need to be put into effect from a policy perspective to better equalize, the opportunities?
two buckets. The first is short-term, what we really need to do urgently, which is, you mentioned equalize, right? We want to make sure that anyone who wants to run for office, this doesn't become prohibitive and disproportionate or disproportionately prohibitive, right? We don't want, if you are lower income and want to run for office, well, good luck, because here's yet another expense you have to deal with, right? Or to say nothing of, we don't want writ large anyone running for office, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, to have to deal with violence and threats to their kids as part of that, and deal with the costs as part of that. So to tackle that, which we talk about, we cite to great work from Vote Mama Foundation and National Council of State Legislators and others that have written about this. A lot of states are modifying or looking to modify their campaign and committee laws to ensure that certain funds can be spent on security. Sometimes that's prohibited by ethics, by other barriers. So making sure that that's possible is really big. So that's, I think, the biggest short-term thing to unlock. Let's say, if those funds are sitting there in the campaign or committee account, we want to make sure that that can actually be put towards a death threat or a bodyguard if that's something that's needed for that person to run. Longer term, though, this is obviously not sustainable, right? We don't want to have this be accepted as status quo that, make sure you set aside your $5 million for your to protect your kids from death threats, right? So all to say, that gets into broader solutions around, lowering the temperature and passing, which we've written about in previous work, passing better privacy laws to, rather than putting the cost onto local law enforcement and to public servants, we stop doxing at the source by limiting personal data, and particularly home address data. So there are other structural solutions we talk about in the report, but I think, A, drawing attention to this, especially the nexus to home and kids, and B, as we noted, passing and reforming some of these campaign and committee laws is sort of a near term. States are already doing it or in the process of looking at it literally right now. So if we're talking next 6 to 12 months, that's a big potential opportunity area.
Justin Sherman is Vice President of the Security Project at the Public Service Alliance. Justin, thank you so much for joining me and bringing this data to our attention.
Thanks very much for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.